The capsule came up on our portside scanner at 0340, ship's time. I was the one awake. I was almost always the one awake at 0340. We had a rotation, same as every other crew function. Cardini on environmental, Sato on propulsion, Marland on navigation, and me on sensor watch, the long graveyard stretch when the instruments hummed their low monotonous note, and the stars outside the viewports didn't move, or seemed not to move, because we were moving with them at a speed the mind refused to fully accept. 312 souls aboard the Ardenza. Descendants, every one of us, of the people the old world had called subversives, radicals, dissidents, enemies of the social order. My grandmother had been one of them. She'd told me, before she died in the lower bunk compartment that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, that the ones who called them subversives had been the ones with their hands on the switches. She'd meant it as a comfort. I wasn't always sure it worked that way. But I thought about her most nights on the graveyard watch, in the particular silence that comes at 0300 when the ship is as close to its sleep as it ever gets, which is not very close at all. Ships don't truly sleep. Neither, if I am being honest, do the people who grew up inside them. We are a people built for wakefulness. We do not have the luxury of trusting that the world will hold together while we are not watching it. So I was at the sensor console, drinking the thin, bitter coffee that Saito brewed every morning from our hydroponics run. He was the only one who had the patience for the brewing ritual. The only one who would take the 40 minutes it required to do it correctly, rather than just dissolving the concentrate. And the anomaly signal pulsed once on the screen, then twice, then settled into a steady amber glow that meant object, metallic composition, approximately 2 meters by 4, tumbling slowly in the drift band we were crossing. I didn't wake the others immediately. I ran the passive scan, first, the way my father had taught me before his heart gave out in my 16th year. You look before you speak, he'd always said. You make sure of what you're seeing before you put it into words, because words have weight out here, and you can't take them back once they're in the air. That was a principle he had from his own father, who had learned it from mine, a chain of transmission that was not in any of our official records, but which was, as far as I was concerned, as important as anything that was. The object was a single-occupant preservation capsule, the kind that had been manufactured in the last decade before the end, when the people who could afford such things had begun to understand. Privately, in offices and boardrooms and government chambers, that civilians were not permitted to enter, that the end was in fact coming, that their policies had produced it, and that some of them intended to survive it regardless. There had been a market for such capsules, a quiet, discreet market, the kind of market that does not advertise itself and does not keep accessible records. The capsule on my scanner had a corporate designation embossed on its hull, visible on high-magnification optical sweep. Tetra Crane Lifehold Systems, serial VK7740, property of the Directorate of Continuity. Of the Directorate of Continuity. I read that 3 times and sat back in my chair and let the coffee go cold. The Directorate of Continuity had been the body that signed the final escalation orders. That was in our records, not the official records, which no longer existed anywhere except possibly in capsules like this one, but in the oral history that the elders had maintained, word for word, generation to generation, the way certain peoples had always maintained the things that mattered most. In the mouth, in the memory, in the act of telling children who had never seen a sky. My grandmother had recited those records to me with the same tone she used for everything important. Not dramatic, not frightened, but steady and deliberate. The tone of someone who knows that the value of information is entirely dependent on whether the person receiving it is paying attention. The Directorate of Continuity had escalated when de-escalation was still possible. They had suppressed the evidence of what their policies were producing. They had made their capsules and distributed them to the people they considered worth preserving. And then they had done what they had already decided to do. And the rest of it. The fires, the atmospheric disruption, the cascade failures in the food systems and the water systems and the power grids. The 83 years of debris dispersing slowly through the orbital plane where a planet had once been. The rest of it was what followed. Here, in a Vestritz crane capsule tumbling in the drift band, was property of the Directorate of Continuity. I woke Marland first, then Cardini, then the captain, Brunato. I did not wake Saito yet, because Saito had a temper and I wanted the facts established before the temper arrived. Brunato was a large, quiet man in his late 40s who had the particular stillness of someone who had never in his life been able to afford panic. He had been born on the Ardenza, same as me, same as most of us below the age of 50. He had never known gravity except the manufactured fraction we ran for bone density, never breathed air that wasn't produced by our own systems, never seen a horizon. He ran the ship the way his mother had run it before him, by the same principles, in the same spirit, which was to say by counsel and by vote, and by the understanding that authority is a loan from the people who grant it, and must be returned to them when they ask. He read my scheme report without speaking, then looked at the viewport, as if the capsule might be visible to the naked eye through 600 kilometers of vacuum, which it was not. "Bring it in," he said. "Captain." He looked at me with the particular patience of a man who has heard the objection before it was voiced. "What are we going to do? Leave it?" "We do not leave things in space that contain people. That is not a principle we negotiate. And what are we going to learn by leaving it?" He had a point. The Ardenza was not in the business of moving on without answers. We had been moving on for too long already. We were heading somewhere, in the general direction of a star system the navigation computers judged potentially habitable by several reasonable criteria. But we had been heading there for 11 years, and we still had decades ahead of us. And the question of what we were doing had never been fully resolved. We were alive, we were together, we were going somewhere. Those three facts took up a great deal of the available certainty, and there was not always room left over for confidence about what we would do when we arrived. We maneuvered to intercept over the next 2 hours, with Marland working the approach trajectory in her careful, meticulous way, shaving the fuel expenditure to the minimum. Every gram of propellant mattered. It had always mattered. We were not a fleet. We were one ship with 312 people inside it, and a journey that had no clear end point, only a direction we had agreed upon together by vote. As we agreed upon all things, Covery Arm brought the capsule into the pressurization lock at 0617. By then, the whole senior crew was in the recovery bay. Me, Marland, Cardini, Cito, Brunato, and old Leonardi, who had been the ship's physician for 30 years, and who, when he first saw the capsule's corporate markings, made a sound I had not heard him make before. Not alarm, exactly. Something older than alarm. The sound a man makes when he recognizes something he was told to remember recognizing. "Directorate of Continuity," he read, standing close enough to the capsule hull that his breath fogged the polished surface. "I know the name. My father spoke of them, my grandmother more than my father." He straightened up. He was a small, lean man with hands that had delivered 11 of the Ardenza's current population into the world, including me, in a way, since he had taken over from the previous physician before I was born, and had been the one standing in the medical bay the night my mother's labor ran long. Those hands were very still at his sides. "We should be careful," he said, "how we proceed." "Is there a life sign?" Cardini asked. I checked my portable scanner. Yes, faint. "The preservation system is still functional. Whoever is in there is alive. Alive. In a capsule that had been tumbling in the drift band, in the region of space where Earth's debris field had been slowly dispersing for the past 83 years. Alive because the capsule had been built by people who could afford to build things that worked, regardless of what those things had cost everyone else to produce, regardless of who had paid for the materials and the labor, and the research and the manufacturing. The capsule had cost approximately what it had cost the rest of the world for the people inside it to have enough. We held a short council in the recovery bay, the 6 of us standing in a rough circle with the capsule on the deck between us. That is how we have always done things, not command, not authority, but counsel. Renato spoke first because he was captain, and that was a functional role, not a superior one, and he was expected to open the space but not to fill it alone. He laid out the options plainly. We could open the capsule, revive whoever was inside, and deal with the result. We could place the capsule in our own cold storage without reviving it, and discuss it further with the full population before making any decision. Or we could put it back in space and leave it where we'd found it, which would be a death sentence administered over whatever remaining years the life support held. Not the third one, Saito said immediately. And for once I agreed with him without reservation. We're not going to execute someone in their sleep, Marlin said. That's not what we are. Not what we are yet, Saito said. He was not smiling when he said it, and the words sat in the air for a moment before anyone responded. If we become that, Brunato said very quietly, then the people who burned the world win a different kind of victory. They win the argument that there is no other way to be. He looked around the circle. We open it. Brunato looked at Leonardi. Doctor. Leonardi had been studying the capsule's exterior interface panel with the focused attention he brought to all diagnostic work. Standard revival protocol, he said. 2-hour warming cycle. Full system monitor throughout. The occupant will be disoriented upon waking. They always are. He paused. What I have read, from what was passed to me through the family histories, the individuals who purchased these capsules were not, as a rule, accustomed to disorientation. They were accustomed to orientation being prepared for them. They will need time before they are coherent. And then, Cardini asked. Leonardi looked up at her. He had kind eyes, always had. The kind of eyes that have seen a great deal of difficulty, and have decided somewhere along the way to remain kind regardless of what the difficulty suggests about the general project of humanity. Then we will know what we are dealing with, he said. We cannot know before. We open the capsule. The cycle took 93 minutes, not 2 hours, because the capsule's systems were operating at higher than expected efficiency. I had the impression, watching the temperature readouts climb in their slow, steady increments, that whoever had designed this capsule had over-engineered it deliberately, had built redundancy upon redundancy, had paid for the very best of everything, because they had intended to survive. Not hope to survive, intended. There is a difference. Is what you carry when you have done what you can, and the outcome is uncertain. Intention is what you carry when you have arranged things to make the outcome certain, regardless of what that arrangement requires. The man who emerged from the capsule was physically unremarkable, medium height, late 60s by appearance, though the preservation would have suspended his aging at the moment of entry, so his actual age was somewhere past 150. He had gray hair, close-cropped, the kind of haircut that says, I have always had a person whose job was to ensure I appeared correctly maintained. He wore a dark suit that had been perfectly maintained by the capsule's systems, no wrinkle in it, as if he had stepped out of a policy meeting rather than 83 years of suspended animation. His hands were the kind of hands that had never done physical labor, not soft exactly, but unformed in the particular way of hands that have held pens and shaken other hands and pointed at things in rooms, but have never gripped a pipe wrench or pulled a cable or scraped bio-sealant off a compromised junction. His face, as consciousness returned and he oriented himself in the recovery bay, was the face of someone unaccustomed to rooms where other people waited for him to speak first. He looked at the 6 of us arranged around him. He looked at the recovery bay, the exposed conduit, the patched bulkheads, the hand-lettered systems labels in 3 different people's handwriting, because the labeled systems had been installed in 3 different eras by 3 different crew rotations. The general evidence that this was a ship maintained by people with limited resources and unlimited ingenuity. He looked at us, each of us in turn, with the measuring quality of someone running an assessment, filing information, deciding who in the room could be used and how. I had never seen a face do that before. I had seen worry and grief and anger and the concentrated focus of people trying to solve a problem together, and the particular exhausted patience of people who are tired but are not going to stop. I had not seen that particular kind of looking, the kind that categorizes without connecting, that calculates without engaging. I understood, in that moment in a way I had not fully understood from the oral histories, why the elders described the old world leadership in the words they had used. Where am I, he said. His voice was steady, not frightened, not relieved, just gathering information. Renato told him. The ship, the date, our general location, relative to where the solar system had been. He explained briefly what had happened to Earth, insofar as we knew it, which was somewhat absurd. since the man in front of us knew better than any of us what had happened to Earth. Because the people who built the capsule were the people who had made it happen. Even if none of them would have used those words, the man listened without visible reaction. His name, he told us, was Counselor Varon. He had held a senior position in the Directorate of Continuity. He named the position with a flatness that I recognized as the flatness of someone who has decided not to give information about relative importance. He had entered his capsule 7 days before the final exchange, when it had become clear that the political process had exhausted itself, and the military one was about to proceed. He had calculated the survival probability, accounted for the drift patterns of the debris field, and determined that recovery within a reasonable time frame was achievable if a vessel with adequate sensors passed through the region. He had calculated. He had determined. He had used those words with complete comfort, which told me something, not about his intelligence, which was clearly substantial, but about what he believed intelligence was for. "And here you are," he said. And for the first time, something moved in his face that might have been satisfaction. "Here you are." We gave him a berth and some time to orient himself, and we brought him food from our common stores. He ate without commenting on the quality, which was itself a kind of comment. The restraint of a man accustomed to better, who has decided that mentioning the better would not serve his current purposes. Over the next several hours he asked Bernardo, Marland, and me a great many questions about our population, our resources, our propulsion capacity, our political structure, our destination, our decision-making process, our record-keeping, our agricultural output per person per day, our fuel reserve status. He asked the way a man asks who already understands what the information means before he receives it. He was very good at it. He was very good at asking questions that sounded like curiosity or gratitude, but were in fact reconnaissance. I started noting the questions in order, in the small personal log I kept on my tablet, not because I knew then exactly what I was noting them for, but because my grandmother had always said that information which seems unimportant in the moment often proves important later, and the habit of recording is worth more than the foresight to know what to record. Lance answered most of the questions, because Marland was our most naturally precise person, and could not help being accurate. She had a mind that processed information in a way I had always admired, not faster than other people's minds, necessarily, but more thoroughly, with a quality of attention that ensured the thing being examined was actually the thing under discussion, rather than a convenient simplification of it. She answered the counselor's questions about navigation, resource allocation, population demographics, and political structure with the same careful precision she brought to plotting an approach trajectory. Saito answered some, and I could see, even in those first hours, that the counselor was noting the edge in Saito, the exhaustion, the frustration, the accumulated weight of a life limit in a metal container, with no horizon, with no ground beneath your feet, with the specific grinding strain of a person who is very skilled and works very hard, and can see more clearly than most of the people around him what the ship's limitations are, and has spent years thinking about how to fix them. The counselor was noting which of us were tired, and which of us carried resentment, and which of us might be, in the language of his world, workable. Said very little. I watched instead. He stayed in the consultation room that first day, and ate from our stores, and he complimented Cardini on hydroponics setup, with the specific technical appreciation of someone who knew enough to make the appreciation sound credible. He expressed what appeared to be genuine interest in our propulsion modifications. Sato's work, primarily, the years of incremental improvement that had increased our drive efficiency by 18% over baseline. He spoke to Brunado with the particular deferential, but not quite, respect that men of his type extend to figures of authority they intend to eventually supersede, a register so precisely calibrated that it could be mistaken, if you were not paying attention, for genuine regard. He said nothing, on that first day, about the Earth. He said nothing about the Directorate. He did not apologize, and he did not explain, and he did not ask us to forgive anything. He simply gathered his information and thanked us for our hospitality, and went to his assigned berth at the end of the day, with the composure of a man who has decided which moves he will make next, and has already moved past the anxiety of deciding. On the second day, he began. It started slowly, the way a structural fault starts. A hairline crack you might not notice. If you are not the kind of person who examines bulkheads carefully, after every transit stress, who runs your hand along the seams, who checks the readings rather than assuming the readings are fine. He began with observations. Observations about efficiency, about resource allocation, about the particular difficulties that arise when decision-making is distributed across a large group rather than concentrated in trained, experienced hands. He was very reasonable about it. He raised the observations as questions, not assertions. Wouldn't it be more effective if, have you considered whether, I wonder if there's a way to, the syntax of a man who understands that direct assertion provokes resistance and indirect suggestion produces the same result with less friction. I had spent enough time in the archives to recognize the shape of the argument, even when it arrived wearing different clothes. The argument was, your way and efficiency is survival, and I can provide what you lack. The argument was, you are tired, and I am not, and I know how to organize things, and you should let me. The argument was, underneath all of it, the oldest argument there was, that order required hierarchy, that hierarchy required someone at the top, and that the people at the top could not be selected by vote because the people doing the voting lacked the information and the intelligence and the long view necessary to make good decisions. He was wrong about that last part. I had spent my whole life watching 312 people make good decisions. Not always the right decisions. There is no such thing as always right, and anyone claiming otherwise is either ignorant or lying, but good ones. Thoughtful ones. Decisions that accounted for the cost to each person in the accounting, the odds, not just the people whose costs were politically visible. Decisions that were slow, sometimes painfully slow, and that required everyone in the room to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty rather than the false comfort of an imposed resolution. The decisions of people who understood that living together is not a problem to be solved, but a practice to be maintained. The counselor was very good at talking, and we were. Saito was right about this much, very tired. By the fourth day I could see it happening. Not a mutiny, not any single dramatic thing, but a gradual shift in the quality of the air in the common spaces, the way air quality shifts when a filter is beginning to fail. Not obviously wrong, not alarming, but subtly not right, with a flatness to it that tells you something is off even before the instruments confirm it. Conversations that used to run long and loud and arrive at some workable consensus were now shorter, harder, more frequently left unresolved. People were agreeing to disagree more than usual, which sounds like a reasonable thing, but on a ship is actually a warning sign. It means people have stopped believing that the process will produce something worth disagreeing for. Saito had begun spending time with the counselor in the consultation room, sometimes for 2 hours at a stretch. He came out of those conversations looking energized in a way I did not trust, because the energy was not the good kind, not the energy of a problem solved or a direction agreed upon, but the energy of someone who has been told that their complaints are legitimate and their opponents are the problem. And the reason things have not improved is not their own exhaustion or the genuine difficulty of the situation, but the inadequacy of the people making decisions. Cardini came to me on the 5th day. She was a quiet, methodical woman who ran the environmental systems, with the focused attentiveness of someone who understood that the air the ship breathed was quite literally in her hands. She kept records of atmospheric composition that were more detailed than the official ship's log required. She believed small changes documented over time told you things that the official log's monthly averages could not. She sat down across from me in the sensor room and looked at her own fingers for a moment before she spoke. He told Saito that the hydroponics yield could be increased by 40% under a centralized management system, she said. That the current committee structure introduces inefficiencies at the decision level that cost us production. He has calculations. He has calculations, I said. They look plausible. Been through the first 2 sections, and I can't find the flaw without spending time I don't have and running the full atmospheric exchange simulation, which takes 14 hours of compute. She paused. What worries me is that Saito found them compelling. And Saito knows the systems as well as anyone, better than most. Saito also hasn't slept more than 4 hours in a row in about 3 years, I said. And he's been angry at the committee structure since the irrigation vote 2 years ago, when we spent 6 weeks deciding something he'd had the answer to in the first hour. He wasn't wrong about that, Cardini said. He wasn't. The process was slower than it needed to be. That's different from the process being wrong. I looked at the scanner, which showed nothing at the moment but the slow data of deep space transit. A compelling argument is very different from a correct one, especially when the person making it has spent 5 days identifying which arguments will be most compelling to which specific people. She looked at me for a moment. What are we going to do? I did not know yet, but had been thinking about something that Leonardi had said. Standing over the capsule in the recovery bay. Not the words about caution, which had been right, but the words that came before them. I know the name. My father spoke of them. My grandmother more than my father. That is the shape of a particular kind of knowledge. Not learned from a text, not certified by any institution, but inherited. Passed down because someone thought it was too important to lose and too dangerous to leave in any medium that could be controlled, seized, or rewritten. The people who burn the world also burn the records that accurately describe them. They have to, because accurate records are a form of accountability, and accountability is incompatible with what they intend to do. My grandmother had passed things to me in the same way. Things about the Directorate of Continuity and the people who ran it, and the specific, concrete manner in which they had operated. Not just the policies, but the methods. How they argued. What they promised. Where they applied pressure. How they identified the people who could be turned. And the people who could not. And what they did differently with each type. I went to find Leonardi. He was in the medical bay, running his daily equipment checks. The same ones he ran every morning and had run every morning for 30 years with the particular consistency of a man who understands that reliability is its own kind of principle. That the value of doing a thing correctly every time is not visible in the individual instance, but only in the aggregate, in the years of clean data and functioning equipment that result from the accumulated discipline. I sat across from him at the equipment bench and told him what I had observed. Dini's report, Saito's new energy, the shape of the counselor's argument, and the particular patient efficiency with which he was moving through the ship's population, identifying the pressure points, learning which of us carried what kind of tired. Leonardi listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, still moving through his equipment check, with the practiced automatic quality of long habit, checking and confirming the items on his list, without needing to devote conscious attention to them. My grandmother described a man, he said, who occupied a senior position in the communications ministry in the years before the end. She was young then, 23, 24, and she had been brought before a review board for distributing unauthorized educational materials. Medical information primarily. Information about reproductive health that the ministry had classified, because they had decided it led to behaviors they considered subversive. He picked up a calibration tool, examined it, set it back in its place. She described the way the review board's chairman spoke to her. Very reasonable. Very interested in her perspective. Very willing to acknowledge the legitimate grievances that had led to her behavior, and to agree that those grievances had merit. What did he offer her? I asked. A position, in the end. Assured her that her skills would be valued, that her voice would be heard through appropriate channels. He explained that the structure existed for good reasons, that it had been built by intelligent people over many years, and that dismantling it, or circumventing it, would cause more harm than good. More harm than staying inside it and working to change it from within. What did she do? She declined, he said. She was imprisoned for another 6 months after declining. When she was released, she went back to distributing the materials, this time through a different network. He looked up at me. She said later that the most useful thing that encounter had taught her was the difference between a man who genuinely believes he is offering something of value and a man who is going through the motions of offering because it serves his purposes to appear to be doing so. Which was he? The second, Leonardi said. Which is the more dangerous type? Genuine believers are at least consistent. Their sincerity limits their flexibility. Men who understand exactly what they are doing and choose to do it anyway can adjust their approach continuously. They are not limited by conviction. They are only limited by what works. I went to Brunato that evening. He already knew. He had been watching too, from his position as captain, which gave him a vantage point none of the rest of us had. Not higher, not superior, but different. The view from a position that interacts with every section of the ship, and therefore registers changes in all of them simultaneously. He had been watching the counselor, and he had also been watching the rest of us watching the counselor. And what he had seen worried him for reasons he had not yet fully articulated even to himself. Been thinking about the vote, I said. So have I, he said. If we put it to a full vote now, with the counselor in residence and 5 days of his arguments already in circulation, I don't know which way it goes. Don't think I can read it. Brunato was quiet for a moment, which were not significantly larger than any other quarters on the ship, because he had never allowed them to be. Same as his mother before him. He had a photograph on the wall, an actual printed photograph, very old, badly faded, the image degrading along one edge where moisture had gotten into the frame at some point in its history, of a sky, daytime sky, blue and cloudless, with something green at the bottom edge that was probably a hillside, or the crown of a stand of trees. None of us had ever stood under a sky like that. None of us would, in any likely version of our future, stand under one for many years yet. He looked at it sometimes with an attentiveness that was not quite longing but was related to it. The look of someone trying to learn by heart, something they will never experience firsthand. There is a reason, he said, that we don't exclude people from the vote when we expect the result to go against us. I know. The moment we start making exceptions to the vote, based on who we think will get it wrong, we have become something else. Something that looks like what we are but is not it. I know that too. I looked at the photograph. I'm not suggesting we exclude anyone. I'm suggesting we need more time, and we need people to have access to the same information I have. More time for people to see what I'm seeing. Time for people to think rather than to feel. Because right now what they're feeling is exhaustion, and what the counselor is offering is rest. Or, Brunato said carefully, you could simply be wrong. In which case, more time and a fair process is exactly what is needed. To prove you right, but to arrive at the truth, whatever it is. That was the weight of it, right there. That was the thing the counselor's kind never seemed to understand, or perhaps did understand, and had decided was an acceptable cost. That, living by the process, means accepting the possibility that the process produces an outcome you believe is wrong. That the value of the process is not that it always produces the right outcome. The value is that it requires everyone inside it to remain honest about the possibility that they might be wrong. Power that is not subject to that requirement corrodes. Corrodes the person who holds it and the structures around them, and, eventually, everything. I went back to my sensor console and worked until Euro 200, and then I started writing. I had no idea whether it would do any good, but the elders had taught us that, when you have something true to say, you say it in the medium where it can reach the most people, as clearly and as plainly as you can, and you trust the people around you to receive it in good faith. Not naively, you acknowledge that some will not, that some people are too tired or too angry or too convinced by the alternative, that some people have already decided. But you start from good faith, because the alternative is to start from the counselor's positions, which is that the people around you are resources to be managed rather than minds to be reckoned with. And if you start from that position, you have already lost what you were trying to preserve. I wrote a summary of what I had observed. Not a polemic, not a denunciation. I had no standing to denounce the counselor for the crime of talking, which was, after all, what I was also doing. I wrote the specific things he had said, in order, with dates. I wrote the specific things I had noticed about how the conversations on the ship had changed in 5 days. I wrote what Leonardi had told me about his grandmother, and what my own grandmother had told me, because those stories were part of the record, and the record should be complete. I included Cardini's report about the hydroponics calculations, and I noted that I had not been able to verify or refute the calculations, and that Cardini had not been able to either, and that the inability to verify was itself a piece of information worth holding carefully, worth asking why. I wrote down what I believed was true about what was happening, and I wrote down the ways in which I might be wrong. I sent it to the ship's general bulletin board at 0600 due, timed for the morning watch rotation. Then I went to sleep. What happened next, I reconstructed from multiple accounts, because I slept for 8 hours. The first 8 uninterrupted hours I had slept in months, perhaps in over a year if I was being precise about it, and a great deal occurred while I was sleeping. Marland read the document first, within minutes of posting. She forwarded it to Leonardi with a single line appended. I've been thinking the same thing but couldn't organize it. Thank you. Leonardi forwarded it to 6 others with his own note attached. Read this carefully, not as an accusation. Questions we should all be sitting with. By the time I woke, the ship was in active discussion. Not the kind of discussion the counselor had been facilitating over the previous 5 days. Not the structured, steered conversations that started with his framing and arrived at his conclusions, but the chaotic, overlapping frustrating, necessary kind that the Ardenza was built for. People talking to people they hadn't talked to in days. People pulling up the historical records to verify specific claims. People asking each other, "What have you been told? And by whom? And does it match what you've observed with your own eyes?" Sato came to find me. I had expected anger, because Saito expressed most things as anger in the first instance, and I was implicitly criticizing time he had spent in the consultation room. There was some, he told me, with precision, and at some length, what I had gotten wrong and what I had failed to understand about how the counselor's proposals actually address the real problems with our systems. But under the anger was something else, something more honest. And after about 10 minutes of that, he paused and looked at his hands and said, "He told me that the problem with our system is that it privileges the opinions of the uninformed, that trained judgment should carry more weight than untrained feeling." "And," I said, "and it sounds right when he says it," Saito said. "It sounds like the obvious truth that no one wants to say." He looked up at me. "But my grandmother was one of the people his people called uninformed. She had no formal education past the age of 14, because formal education was only available to people who could pay for it or test into the subsidized slots, which required a preparation that was also only available to people who could pay for it. She knew how to keep a reactor running, and how to grow food in a closed system, and how to read a person's face and tell the difference between someone who was frightened and someone who was pretending to be frightened, because it served them to appear frightened." He stopped. "When he calls her uninformed, what exactly does he mean?" I didn't answer. The answer was obvious, and Sato already knew it. Brunato called the full council that afternoon. All 312 of the Ardenza's population in the common spaces, with the audio distributed through the intercom system to every section of the ship, so that the people on essential duty rotation could listen if not attend in person. We had done this before, many times. For major decisions, for crises, for the moments when the direction of the ship needed to be set by the people the ship contained. We did it clumsily, and it took a long time. And it was sometimes not what any given individual would have chosen alone. We did it. The counselor was brought in. He sat at the council table with the same stillness he had shown on waking from the capsule. That absolute composure that came, I had decided, from a lifetime of operating in rooms where he controlled the terms of engagement. He looked out at the assembled faces, 312 of them arranged in the common spaces, and listened through the intercom in their sections, and I saw him make his assessment. Still, even now, still running the numbers, still looking for the pressure points. Brunato spoke first. He summarized the situation without editorializing. The capsule, the recovery, the counselor's stated background, the conversations of the past 5 days, and the document I had written. He read several passages from the oral history that documented the Directorate of Continuity's role in the final sequence of decisions. He read the counselor's name against the historical record we maintained, which listed specific decisions made by specific individuals in the final decade before the end. He read them without commentary, in the flat, careful voice he used, for things that needed to be received rather than interpreted. Then he invited the counselor to speak. The counselor spoke for a long time. He acknowledged the historical record without apologizing for it. He reframed it, instead, as decisions made in an impossible situation by individuals who had been trying to prevent something worse, who had been constrained by political dynamics outside their direct control, who should be understood in their context, rather than judged by people who had the luxury of hindsight and the distance of 80 years. He spoke about the structure of governance, about the inherent difficulty of making decisions for large populations under conditions of uncertainty. He spoke about the future. Not the past, not the decisions, not the people who had died, but the future, the destination we were heading toward, the needs we would have when we arrived, the infrastructure and the structure that would be required. He had given this considerable thought, clearly, and the plans he sketched were specific and detailed, and drew on genuine knowledge of systems engineering that was not unintelligent and was not entirely wrong. He was making the best possible case for himself in the best possible words, and some of what he said was not entirely incorrect. And a worse audience, a more tired audience, an audience that had not spent the past several hours reading the oral histories and comparing them to what they had observed in the past 5 days, might have been moved by it. He finished speaking. There was a silence in the common space that lasted a full 30 seconds. I counted them before the questions began. The questions were not the ones he was expecting. He had prepared for objections about his record, about the moral accounting, about whether he deserved to be received at all. What he received instead were questions about his model, specific technical questions about his specific technical proposals, about who, in his proposed governance structure, would hold authority over whom. By what mechanism authority would be transferred when it needed to change hands? What recourse would exist for people who believed the authority was being exercised incorrectly? And specifically whether that recourse required the permission of the authority being questioned. Cardini asked about the hydroponics calculations. She had spent the previous 4 hours going through them with 2 others, running the simulations on the ship's secondary compute cluster. She presented their findings clearly and without theatrics. The 40% yield increase was theoretically achievable, and the underlying agricultural science was sound. But the model assumed a level of compliance and coordination among the people doing the growing that only existed if those people could not override the decisions of the central coordinator. The calculations were internally consistent. They were also structured so that their efficiency gains disappeared entirely if the people operating under them retained meaningful decision-making autonomy. It was not a false claim. It was a true claim that depended, without stating that dependence, on a fundamental shift in who had authority over what. Leonardi asked about medical authority under the proposed structure. Who would make decisions about resource allocation in a genuine emergency? Could override the physician's assessment of patient need, and on what basis? Old Hammerman, who was 81 years old and had been born on this ship, and had spent 60 years working in the engineering section, and had a directness that his age had only sharpened, asked, "You say trained judgment should carry more weight than untrained feeling. Who determines what counts as training?" My cousin Falzoni, 16 years old, born on this ship and never anywhere else, who had spent his entire conscious life inside this conversation and understood it from the inside in a way that none of the older generations entirely could, asked, "In your system, counselor, who decides who is qualified to vote?" The counselor answered that question for 4 minutes. He answered it thoroughly and with evident thought. At the end of those 4 minutes, Brunato asked him to answer it in 1 sentence. He could not do it. That was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No one shouted, no one wept, no one delivered a speech they had prepared in advance. Just a question and an inability to answer it simply. And 312 people sitting with that inability and understanding what it meant and what it had always meant and why the people who had always been unable to answer it had always found other questions to answer instead. We voted. I don't pretend the vote was clean or that the outcome was obvious. 209 for, 87 against, 16 abstentions. The 87 who voted against were not wrong to do so. They had applied the same good faith reasoning that the process demanded. They had come to a different conclusion, and that conclusion was legitimate. They had heard the same arguments I had heard, and had weighed them differently, in good faith, with their own accumulated experience and their own genuine concerns. Process accommodated that. That is what processes are for, not to produce unanimity, which is a fiction, but to produce a decision that everyone was part of making, even the ones who lost. After the count was read, the room was quiet in a way that was different from silence. People quietly, though I could not have told you whether they were the ones who had voted with the majority or against it. Grief does not always align cleanly with political outcomes. I think Sato, who had voted against, caught my eye across the room, and what I saw in his face was not what I had expected. Not anger. Something more complicated. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like the particular expression of a person who is relieved to have been heard, and is not certain what to do with the fact that the hearing did not change the outcome. The vote determined that the counselor would not be given a governing role of any kind on the Ardenza, that he would be given a working berth, same as anyone else, with the same rights and the same responsibilities as any other resident of this ship, that he would be brought before open council once per month, in a session open to the full population, where the conversation would continue and where his knowledge and experience would be available to the ship as a whole, that we would not pretend the history did not exist, and we would not pretend that 80 years of suspended animation was sufficient to settle any question, and we would not pretend that the question of what accountability looked like in our circumstances had an obvious answer. What we would do was what we had always done. We would hold it together. We would remain honest about what we knew and what we didn't, and we would make our decisions in the open, and we would be wrong sometimes and correct ourselves, and we would keep going. He accepted the vote without visible reaction. That composure, that absolute surface calm, could not read, watching him receive the result. Whether he was already calculating his next move, or whether something else was happening underneath it. Some slow, unfamiliar recognition, perhaps, that he was in a different kind of room than any he had ever been in before. Room where the outcome of the calculation was not under his control and could not be brought under his control through any application of skill or patience he possessed. I hoped it was the second thing, did not expect it. I held the hope and did not mistake it for confidence. That evening I was back at the sensor console, the long graveyard watch. The stars not moving or seeming not to move. I was drinking Saito's coffee, which was still thin and still bitter, and was, I had come to understand over years of it, one of the reliable physical facts of my life. Not a comfort exactly, since it was objectively not good coffee, but a constant, and out here, past the wreckage of the old world, constancy was what you had instead of comfort most of the time. The long-range scanner lit up at 0211, not the amber pulse of a tumbling capsule. A different color, the pale blue of a high-velocity contact at the edge of sensor range, approaching on a trajectory that our navigation system began calculating automatically. Then a second contact, then 6. Then the scanner went slightly frantic in the way it did when there were more returns. Then it was designed to enumerate cleanly, the display flickering and recalculating as the numbers climbed. I sat forward. I pulled up the trajectory analysis. I ran the transponder query, which came back empty. No active transponders, no identifying broadcast, consistent with vessels running silent on approach. But the mass signatures, the drive signatures, the formation pattern that the scanner was beginning to assemble from the accumulating contacts. I had never seen a fleet. I had never in my life seen more than one other vessel. But I knew what the records described. I knew what the second-generation transcriptions said about the ships that had been in construction when Earth ended. The other survivor vessels that had gone in different directions and maintained radio silence for security reasons, and which we had in our most private moments of late-night watch, sometimes allowed ourselves to hope, might still be out there, might still be intact, might still be moving. The formation was organized, not the scattered tumble of debris, not the erratic pattern of objects responding to chance physics and orbital mechanics, but the deliberate geometry of ships that knew where they were going and had agreed to go there together. The way we knew where we were going, the way we had agreed. I sat with it for a long moment. The contacts kept updating, the scanner building its picture return by return. I thought about my grandmother in her lower bunk, in the compartment that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and the things she had given me in the years before she died, and what she would have said about this particular moment. She would have said, "Tell them." I picked up the intercom handset. I held it for a moment longer, because the moment felt like the kind that should be held, not hurried. 312 people. And whoever was out there, and 83 years of distance between the world that burned, and whatever came next. Then I opened the channel. "All hands," I said. "This is Falzoni on Sensor Watch. I need you to wake up." I looked at the scanner. The formations was resolving. The computer compiling the returns into recognizable mass profiles, into the shapes of ships, into the shapes of other people who had survived. "We have company," I said. "A lot of it. And it's coming toward us." I heard the ship begin to stir around me, the sound of hatches opening, of feet on deck plates, of voices starting up in the corridors, the particular quality of 312 people waking up to something at once. It was a sound unlike any other in my experience. Not alarm, and not relief yet, because it was still too early for relief, but something between those two things, something that was closest to recognition. The sound a community makes when it understands that something has changed and gathers itself to meet it together. The scanner kept its count. I kept watching. Outside the viewports, the stars held their positions. Same as always, unchanging at this scale. The patient distances of the universe indifferent to our small anxious hopes. Across those distances, at speeds that defied any intuition evolved under a single sun, the lights were moving. They were moving toward us. 312 souls on the Ardenza. I didn't know how many were out there in the approaching ships, with their silent transponders and their careful formation geometry. Whatever the number, they were not debris. They were not waste. They were not the remnants of something that had ended. They were the continuation of something that had refused to end. The way things that are truly alive refuse to end, even when every reasonable calculation says they should. Even when the people with the authority to decree endings have decreed one. Even when the world itself has been burned down to its last coherent orbit. The counselor was somewhere on the ship. In the berth we had assigned him, sleeping or not sleeping, running his net calculations in the dark. In the morning he would wake to a different conversation than the one he had been preparing for. So would all of us. I held the contacts on the scanner, and I did not look away. The pale blue traces multiplying in the dark. Other ships. Other people. Other descendants of the ones who had been called subversives, radicals, enemies of the social order. Everything except what they actually were, which was the people who had understood something true and had refused, at great cost, to stop understanding it. Coming home to each other across the long dark between stars. The coffee was cold. I drank it anyway. It was what I had. Some things you hold because they are good. Some things you hold because they are what you have. Out here, past the edge of the old world, those two categories had a tendency to become the same thing. And after long enough, if you were lucky and you were careful, and you kept doing the hard, slow, unglamorous work of staying honest with each other, you stopped needing to tell them apart.